Welcome, everyone. We will begin in just a minute with Emily, and we are recording this webinar, and a link will be sent out later.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. It is noon and we want to be mindful of your time today. So we are going to get started. Welcome to today's family development webinar, part of the Finding Balance series. And we are going to be talking about rural resiliency in times of ambiguity. As we get started, and you perhaps saw a little pop-up come up on your screen, if you want or need closed captioning so you can read along with what we're saying, you can see on this slide here, find the closed captioning button at the bottom of the window, and then you should be able to select to turn it on. You can also turn captions off at any time if you would like to. So again, welcome. My name is Emily Kruckelberg. I am an extension educator in farm safety and health with University of Minnesota Extension, and I will be one of your presenters today.
Hi, I'm Jennifer McGuire. I'm a professor in family social science and a statewide specialist in family development, and I will be your other presenter today.
I would also like to introduce Rick Meyer. He is our webinar producer today. He's with Extension in Administration. So if you are having any tech issues, something's going on with your video or your audio, you can't hear, you can send Rick a message in the chat. He will also be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions as we go through today's presentation, you can ask them as we go, just put them in the chat, and then Rick will make sure that we get to those. We'll also have time for questions at the end. So if you want to hang on to your questions, you can do that as well. And just before we jump into our content here, Jennifer and I want to give a quick thank you to the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. This work that we've been doing in ambiguous loss has been supported by MDA's Bend Don't Break initiative, which is advancing the work in farm stress and rural mental health in Minnesota. So thank you to the Department of Agriculture for their support of this program. So today, like our title says, we're going to be talking about resiliency, and really specifically resiliency in times of ambiguity. So when things aren't super clear to us. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today is based off the theory of ambiguous loss, which was developed by Dr. Pauline Boss. She's a professor emeritus at the University of Minnesota. So as we start with this conversation, I want to talk a little bit about loss and grief. And I know the slide says in farming and agriculture, but we can really extend that out to our rural communities in general. So just as we frame some of this up, when we talk about loss, we are really talking about what is removed, right? So the local grocery store left town, something like that, the thing that is removed. And the grief is really the process that we go through, and it is a process that is expected to end. When most of us hear about grief or think about grief, I think most of us kind of tie that to what we feel when we lose somebody that means a lot to us. So in death, that is a loss. The person is no longer around, and we grieve them. But again, it's long been accepted that grief is really this process that's expected to end. And a lot of that comes from the long accepted 5 stages of grief, which you may be familiar with: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. However, these 5 stages of grief were originally put together by Kubler-Ross to describe the stages of grief that someone who is dying goes through. And then what happened is we kind of took that model and started applying it to all grief. But again, these 5 stages of grief don't fit equally in all types of loss. And they do assume that at some point the grief is going to end. But we know that grief can be disrupted or can continue for a very long time, really depending on the type of loss and the process of moving forward. And we know that talking about grief directly can support resiliency and give people tangible steps to help move forward. So in our rural community, grief can be focused on a lot of different things. Like I mentioned, the loss of infrastructure, the loss of people, lost investment in the community, families moving out of the community and not coming back. Lots of different losses that we can see, and that affect us both on the community level and on the personal level as well. So diving a little bit deeper into grief. Okay, and so we're really talking about this today through the lens of ambiguous loss. So there are many, many, many types of grief. These three that we're going to be discussing here are the three that are most commonly tied to ambiguous loss. So some types of grief that we maybe don't always think about in other situations where there might be a clear loss. So the types of grief we're going to be thinking about today are anticipatory, disenfranchised, and frozen grief. So anticipatory grief occurs upon realizing a loss is imminent, but before the loss has occurred. So a grieving process begins for a loss that is coming, but it might not be publicly acknowledged, especially if that thing hasn't been lost yet, right? So small town business, things are maybe not going well for them financially. They kind of feel like they're floundering. And so it's possible the family that owns this business may start to, grieve the loss of the store if they know that it's coming, right? Or perhaps they think, this loss is imminent. And so they start this grief process, right? And now what can also happen here is that loss doesn't end up happening. And it's important to remember that if that is the case, if people still felt anticipatory grief, that grief is still very valid. It's still a grieving process that they went through, even though the thing maybe in the end wasn't actually lost. So it's really, thinking about, I apologize, I lost my spot in my notes here. So, these processes can set in really early, and again, if this loss doesn't occur, people may also experience survivor's guilt. And so how families and individuals experience these losses can really set the stage for how things move forward and for how this grief might or might not be acknowledged. So the second type of grief is disenfranchised grief. And I know that this is one of Jennifer's personal favorites. So disenfranchised grief is a grief that is not understood or taken seriously. So, there are some basic features of losses that are disenfranchised. If it's not openly acknowledged, if it's not socially sanctioned, there's no public grief or mourning. And when grief is disenfranchised, the people with the losses can become disconnected from their social network and feel alienated, traumatized, or unable to process the loss. Loss of property, bodily injury, loss of a job or livelihood are all losses that need grieving and are all losses that we see in our communities, across the state, regardless of size. So these types of losses can affect anyone and, can really create grief in a broad circle around the initial impact. So recognizing and validating the losses of our own and those around us allow us to more openly admit those feelings of loss and to publicly grieve. So an example of disenfranchised loss, and this is an example Jennifer uses quite a bit. She does a lot of work with LGBTQ youth, and we see a lot of disenfranchised grief with that, with those groups, people who are maybe have come out to their parents and are no longer being accepted and are kind of going through that grieving process of losing their family. But that grief might not be fully, acknowledged by everyone. It might not be socially sanctioned in all communities, right? And so that grief may be disenfranchised because other people aren't, willing to see that grief and acknowledge it. Frozen grief is the third type of grief, and it's the result of the ambiguity of not yet knowing whether or not any effort will be successful. So this frozen grief can go on for many years while various efforts are made to try to salvage various aspects of whatever it might be, the business, the family, land that they may own, whatever it may be. And again, this can go on for many, many years. And really, the uncertainty of the future does not allow for anyone to really fully grieve and move on. So you're just kind of frozen there, trying to figure out, is this going to work? Are we going to be okay or not? Kind of pushing off that grief as much as they can. And also, this is where we might see people that seem like they have this sense of dread, like they just think something bad is going to happen. And that can really be frozen grief. And a big thing with frozen grief is we don't give that grief a chance to run its normal course, right? Because we're trying to put it off. We're trying to freeze it. So those are some types of grief. We also think about the types of loss. And again, this is where the ambiguous loss piece is really going to come into play. So when we think about loss, there's kind of two major types typically. A physical loss, so an actual thing, an item, a person, money. And then there's also psychological losses. So that can be, a relationship that you may have somebody that is gone, the meaning you might carry for something, an identity for yourself or someone else that you might carry. Those are things, again, that we can lose. And so again, physical losses, that would be, again, a business closes, perhaps a prominent person in the community moves out of town, something like that. And then these psychological losses, again, can come into play as communities change and as families change, and our identities to those things might change as well. So now we're going to kind of walk through how we might determine if something is an ambiguous loss or not. So I'll say this now, and then again when we have our chart all filled out here. Ambiguous loss is really marked by a discongruence between psychological loss and physical loss, meaning you have one but not the other. So we're going to fill this chart in here, and you can see along the top, we have physical loss and yes or no if we've experienced it, and psychological loss, again, yes or no. So first we have both a physical loss and a psychological loss. So if both of those have happened, it is a clear loss. Again, the best example I have of clear loss is when somebody passes away. So, physically, we know that they are gone. Psychologically, we also know that they are gone. And again, this is not to say, we still remember the dead and we carry them in our hearts and all of that. But again, this is where, when we talk about psychological loss here, we mean, that thing is gone. That it has changed, right? You might still love your grandma very, very much, but you also know that she has passed away. That loss is clear. And then if there is no physical loss and no psychological loss, not a loss. This box is basically here to fill out our chart so that it looks nice. So you can see here, if you have both, clear loss. Neither, not a loss. So now this is where we get into if you only have one. So our first example, type 1 loss, is a physical loss with no psychological loss. Okay, so something that is physically gone, but still psychologically present. So an example of this in ambiguous loss theory is missing children, soldiers missing in action in war. So physically, we do not know where that person is. But psychologically, we don't know that they're gone, right? We still believe that they will come back, that they are okay, that they are alive. And so there's one type of ambiguous loss where something is physically gone for us, but psychologically it's not. And then in type 2 loss, that's where we see a psychological loss without the physical loss. So an example of this from the theory would be people who have dementia or Alzheimer's, right? So physically, they are still present. They are still with us. We can still go see them. But of course, in dementia, psychologically, over time, we may lose that person, right? So they no longer know who we are. They don't know who they are. These different pieces that, yes, this is my mother, but, psychologically, she's not present as my mother anymore. So those are some ways that we can see it. Some other kind of examples to help you think about how this might show up in communities and in families. So I mentioned something that might be physically present, psychologically gone. So this is a farming example, but we could also apply it to, small family-owned businesses in our communities. A parent that is perhaps so preoccupied with running the farm or with running that business that they are negligent to their children's and their family's needs, and those relationships suffer, right? So in that case, the ambiguous loss here is, I'm a child and yeah, mom and dad are here, they're around, but they're so busy focusing on these other things that, psychologically, I'm not connected with them the way I used to be. So those are the ways that, we can see ambiguous loss. And again, there are these two different types. Jennifer and I don't focus too much on, is this type 1 or is this type 2? We really use this chart especially to illustrate that, it doesn't necessarily matter if it's type 1 or 2, it matters if it's ambiguous, right? Do we have one and not the other? So it's that discongruence between physical and psychological loss that we see this. And so that's our main point with that. And now we are going to talk a little bit more about what can be done in situations of ambiguous loss. So I primarily work with farming, but anybody I work with in any community, they want to know what they can do about something. And the thing with ambiguous loss that we need to remember is that this grief may never actually end for people, right? And so it's not so much a matter of how do we cure the grief? It's how do we learn to cope and live with this grief to make us more resilient as we move through our lives, coping with ambiguous loss. So now I am going to toss it over to Jennifer, who is going to kind of take us through the second half of these slides, which really focus on resilience and providing actionable strategies for how we can do that.
Thank you, Emily. I'll start with sharing, there are some really distinct ways that rural communities in particular are faced with ambiguous losses. So for instance, in a rural community, it may be more likely that people have to leave the community for education or for work opportunities. And so that creates an ambiguous loss when family members are away, but are still part of the family, but have had to leave for training or for employment. The same is true when related to the economics of a rural community where things that may have been thriving at one point when, say, one place shuts down, it could really influence the losses that a lot of other associated people have. Like, for instance, a mine closes down and then people in the area, a lot of other small businesses might also fail. So the second part of this webinar, we'll talk about resilience. And we are talking about resilience in a way that combines two major theories or two major contributing scholars to resilience. So one is Pauline's work, and the other is the work of Ann Maston, who's also here at the U of M. And so resilience has multiple components. but it's essentially the process and outcome of successfully adapting to difficult or challenging experiences. So once something difficult has happened, you can adapt to that, and you grow and change in different ways. Another component of resilience, and this is a major contribution of Ann Maston's work, is developing mental, emotional, or behavioral flexibility and adjustment to internal and external demands. What that means is that you're then ready for things that happen before they happen. And so resilience can exist both by someone who's had a crisis, but also we can build resilience in people who didn't have a crisis. And so that's the approach that we take to resilience in this series of workshops that Emily and I have been developing. And it includes both the protective factor of resilience, which is our capacity as humans to grow out of crisis. And it also includes the promotive element of resilience, which is the capacity of humans to make themselves ready for crisis, or just make themselves more competent prior to a crisis occurring. Resilience is often also thought about as something associated with post-traumatic growth, which is that part of us as human beings that has a capacity to grow, to have a crisis, and then for us to grow in response to that crisis and grow beyond the skills that we had prior to the crisis, right? So that in learning to deal with something that was stressful, we develop skills that we didn't realize we could have. Okay, there are six different ways that Pauline Boss described as mechanisms for building resilience. And we'll go over each of those and then talk about each of them in a sort of rural context. So specifically, they're reconstructing identity, redefining your identity to fit the new situation or dynamics that you're in. Adjusting mastery has to do with a sense of understanding differently what you can and can't do. And that could include improving our sense of mastery, but it could also include recognizing that we don't have the mastery that we once thought we had over certain things. Normalizing ambivalence is where we learn to understand that our conflicted feelings are normal, that it's okay to both be really upset about something and also to be relieved by it. Revising attachment, coming to terms with our new and changing relationships. So the ways that our lives change when we have a crisis or when other things outside of us change. Finding meaning, which is identifying and taking meaning in the loss that we've had and creating rituals around it and having a sense of purpose related to our losses. And finally, discovering hope, being comfortable with ambiguity and having hope for the future. So we'll have one slide on each of these that goes into a little bit more depth and gives some examples. So reconstructing identity. First, what this means is to redefine who you are now and kind of what you see as your core strengths and weaknesses, what your background is going to be in terms of how you deal with things. An example of this in farming might be, well, you were a dairy farmer your whole life, and now you have sold all of your cows. And so do you still identify as a farmer, or are you changing your identity of who you are? So there can be benefits for both of those elements of ways to think about shifting gears and changing who we are. Some very specific ways to facilitate that include redefining our psychological family. So who's a member of who's the in-group, who's the out-group of our psychological family, and then thinking about the family boundaries. So who do we want to identify as closest and connected to us? And this can change within a crisis, and someone who may not have been considered a member of the family before might now be considered a member of the family, and someone else might not. That could change, where somebody who used to be in and busy and with the family all the time is now kind of moving on their own way and is no longer considered a member of the family. You can think about defining your psychological family by thinking about who do you love and who feels like family to you, and being clear about that can help you to reposition your own identity. There are some things that can inhibit our ability to restructure our identity. So the first one, it's really difficult if you're stuck on a formal identity or a set of activities. So for instance, if you were involved with say, playing tennis, and you really viewed yourself as a tennis player and you really love playing tennis, and then all of a sudden you hit a reason or a point in your life where you're no longer physically able to play tennis, it can be really stressful if you aren't able to reconstruct that identity, if you're really stuck on the playing of tennis, right, as a major component of who you are. Okay, another thing that can interfere with that is not having an openness to change. So thinking, well, I have to be a certain way and I can't change how I am. That can interfere with restructuring your identity and with several of the forms of resilience. Okay, our next form of resilience is developing resilience is about adjusting mastery. So in adjusting mastery, we temper or enhance our own sense of what we are able to do, right? Or what our mastery is. And in doing that, we have to recognize that the world is not always a fair place. So it may be that we believed that if you try hard, like this is the American dream, if you try hard, if you do everything right, if you do all your work, you will be successful. Well, that is not always true. It's not necessarily true in many cases. And being able to recognize that there's a system around you that doesn't necessarily respond to you in the way that you've always been taught, right? So that you learn in adjusting mastery to externalize some of the blame for things that have happened and to recognize that it may not be fair what happened, right? But it still happened and you're still who you are. There's a few ways to facilitate this. The first one, we have to rethink what is our place in the world and kind of know where we are and what we truly do and don't have control over. And we learn to understand the unfairness of our specific loss and as well as the systems that contribute to our specific loss. We can facilitate this by basically taking care of ourselves, showing up in our full self as much as we can every day. So sleep, meditation, eating healthfully, doing all the things that help us to show up as our best selves. The other is to examine a system's functioning to see like how does this work, why this happens and is unfair, and is there any power that I do have to alter the system? So, for example, one of the biggest examples that we have of adjusting mastery has to do with our national system for Amber Alerts. And it was parents of missing kids who established this protocol when they realized that it was too difficult to communicate across communities when a child was missing. And so they created a system that allowed us to better notify people when kids are missing. And that was an element of examining the unfairness of the system, figuring out what mastery they could or couldn't have over that, and then creating a system that gave them more mastery over that. People can struggle with adjusting mastery when they continue to see their loss as a personal failure. So if something is lost and someone is taking it personally, or they have pressure on themselves to get over it, they can really struggle with moving forward on that. Continuing grief is a sensible reaction to a loss that never ends. And it's not a failure to get over an unending loss, right? When a loss is continuing to go on, it is reasonable that we continue to grieve. It's not pathological grief. It's a frozen grief that's associated with an ambiguous loss. And so changing our sense of mastery and changing our expectations of ourselves about that can help to create that resilience that helps us to move forward. Okay, the next form of the next strategy for developing resilience is normalizing ambivalence. So I'll start with thinking with what's the difference between ambivalence and ambiguous, because that's something that comes up a lot and it's something that I often have to remind myself about. So ambivalent means that we have mixed or contradictory feelings, more than one feeling about something. So we have ambivalent feelings because we both like it and hate it. We both want it and want it to go away. We are bothered by it, but we're also relieved. So those are ambivalent feelings. Ambiguous means that something's that's not clear or it can be understood in many ways. So a loss is ambiguous because you can't really, it's not clear, is it exactly what's lost or how it's lost? And our own ability to understand ambivalence has to do with our own willingness to say, well, I really miss this person and I'm relieved that I have made all of these new social, and emotional relationships through my work and trying to restructure with this person. So when a loss is ambiguous, it's very likely that people will have ambivalent feelings about it, because there's pieces that they're really happy about, but pieces also that they're upset or confused about. It's normal to feel conflicted with a grief that has no closure. And for some, those conflicted feelings are stressful, and they may focus on trying to rid themselves of the ambivalent feelings. So that's one thing that people can do that gets them stuck, is trying to get rid of our ambivalent feelings. However, we can learn a lot from our ambivalent feelings, and those feelings may not go away. Resilience comes when we learn to cope with and feel okay about having ambivalent feelings. It's okay to have mixed feelings about something. And we learn to talk about the conflicted nature of our feelings. So it can help to normalize or take the power away from the internal conflicts that we're having. So for instance, in rural environments, maybe there's a farm business or a family business, and the finances of that become really stressful. And so one member of the family chooses to take a job through a corporation that provides a steady income, and it gives health insurance and other kinds of benefits. So it could feel really stressful to take that job, like it's an identity loss away from the family business, but it also can be really a relief because of the financial stability that it can provide, and as well as the health insurance or the other things. And it could also provide a distraction from the difficulty of the family-owned business at that time. There's some ways to facilitate normalizing ambivalence, and a lot of them have to do with documenting or talking through the conflicted feelings that you have. So working with a counselor or a minister or a friend to get support about and name the conflicted feelings, so that you can really understand what are the things that you're feeling in a positive way about, and what are the things that feel more nuanced, and what are the things that feel more negative. Writing that out and thinking about it are ways that can help to reduce the power in those feelings by giving them a name and by explaining them and hearing someone's response to them. Ultimately, having conflicted feelings is very normal, and it can last indefinitely. There are things you might have conflicted feelings about for the rest of your life. Feeling comfortable just coping with those feelings is one of the pathways to resiliency. It's a pathway that can help you for future ambivalent feelings that all of us will have. Things that hinder the normalizing of ambivalence is hiding conflicted feelings. So pretending like, oh no, I'm only happy about this, or I'm only upset about this, or denying that sometimes you wish the struggle that you're in was over. And so when people try to gloss over it or pretend like it's not really happening or not true, then that can make it very difficult to really disentangle and feel comfortable with the ambivalent feelings that people might have. Okay, our next strategy for building resilience is revising attachment. And this is similar to reconstructing identity, but revising attachment is more of a relational strategy, whereas identity is more internal. So when we're attached to something, a certain outcome can make it having an attachment to an outcome can make it very difficult to adjust to a new reality. So we care a lot about something. It's very hard to accept that the outcome that we wanted may not happen. Learning to change our sense of attachment to that can also help to create space and comfort to have a new approach. So when you think through what was lost, you can change the importance of what was lost, right? So it may feel like, everyone has left the community that you're in. And so what you feel like you've lost is everyone, every possible relationship, or it can feel really big if your three best friends moved away. When you change the importance of that, you learn to say, well, okay, I can grieve that. I can grieve what I lost, which was my three best friends, but there are other people I can create relationships with. And I also can keep my relationships with my three best friends, only in different ways. So you change your attachment to what you still have, and you can celebrate the pieces that are there. It also clears space for you to create new relationships. So for instance, someone may feel very strongly about family land, and land that's been used in the same way a long time, or has been a member of a certain family for a long time, and letting go of that attachment to the land might make it easier to think through different options for how to use the land for future generations. And so that it's that attachment to, this is how land should be used, or this is what this house means, or this is what a building or a structure or an entity means in a community. So ways to revise attachment. One of the big ways to revise attachment is to develop or redevelop relationships. And a really good example of facilitating new relationships in a way that revises attachment is when someone goes into recovery. So they may quit drinking or quit other substance use. And it can be hard if you're still very attached to the lifestyle that involved drinking or substance use. And a way to revise that attachment is to create new relationships with other people who also aren't drinking or using substances. And so then all of a sudden you have a new community of people, and it doesn't mean you leave your other community, but you have these new relationships that help you to change your thinking about substances. That can be true for a variety of different things. So for instance, in the example of the tennis player, starting to make friends with other people who also are not tennis players can help, or a new activity that you do that can help you to feel a new sense of attachment and even create a new identity in those new spaces. The new relationships that you develop will help you to support and reflect your new reality and help you change your attachment to your old reality. It can be very hard to revise attachment without intentionally letting go of what you are attached to. So attempts to cling to a former reality or people who are no longer present can interfere with letting go of old attachments. Holding on to prior assumptions will also interfere with revising attachments. So if for instance, you had your 3 best friends and you had assumptions about some of the other people who might be friends in the community, and you keep those assumptions about those people, it can be very hard to create a relationship with people you might have assumptions about. So letting go of those assumptions, being open to the new relationships, being very clear that you're changing your attachment to the people who left, will help you to have new relationships and kind of revise your attachments. Resisting the new relationships that come with a new part of life can make it a lot harder to move forward. Another example of this is, say, if a family in any community moves to a new church, and for whatever reason, they may have a hard time letting go of the old church, and in the new church, they may not want to make relationships with the people there, but letting go of assumptions about who's there and why, and creating new relationships with those people can help to revise your attachment, build some resilience. Okay, our next strategy for building resilience is about finding meaning. And so this is one that can start early, but it's also one that sometimes comes after you've spent a little bit of time working on resilience. So you give the loss a name, you talk with other people about it, you can adapt your family rituals or have some spirituality or a sense of forgiveness around the loss. This is an internalized sense of meaning from a loss. And the ways to facilitate this includes talking with other people. So letting people know what you lost and why, and what you feel you've learned from it or what you've gained from it, adapting family rituals, and then also having a sense of spirituality and forgiveness can help people to have more meaning in the loss that they have. When our loss has a meaning, we can carry forward with it in a way that we've grown from the loss, as opposed to a loss that we don't see as having a meaning. There are specific steps we can take that help to create meaning, like having an activity or a ritual associated in honor with something, lighting a candle, or even making a toast about something. We can remind ourselves over time of the meaning that we gained by having those rituals that we perform over and over at different times. Some of the impediments to making meaning stem from isolation, or having a desire to seek revenge. So if a loss was significant and you're angry about it and want a sense of revenge, it is quite typical for many people to want revenge when they've had a loss. That seeking of revenge can make it very hard to move forward in a more productive way, and certainly harder to find meaning. Keeping secrets from other people about our loss makes it hard to find meaning. And when we separate ourselves from others physically or emotionally, it can be hard to find meaning. Okay, the sixth strategy that we have for developing resilience is called discovering hope. And this is about being comfortable with the ambiguity that we have, and the ambiguity of our loss, and feeling hope that we will have a brighter future. This allows us to move forward from even the greatest tragedies and stressors in life. And hope is one of the uniquely human emotions that fosters connection to others and feelings of a potentially brighter future. An example of finding hope can be the community that is formed out of loss. So, for instance, sometimes when there's an ambiguous loss or something unfair happens, people will gather together to address the system that contributed to that ambiguous loss. And the relationships that develop among that new community are a form of hope for people, that they have all of a sudden new relationships, new skills, and new people in their lives. It can come through many pathways. So becoming more comfortable with the ambiguous nature of life allows us to have more hope. Having some sort of spiritual practice and self-care, also laughing at the absurdity sometimes of the losses that we have, and recognizing that sometimes, even though it's not funny at all, it's also very funny. And so recognizing the jokes that we can have about that, being comfortable with the unfair nature of the world. So letting go of the notion that we expect our world to be fair, and feeling comfortable with the fact that our world is unfair at times. And learning to balance that there are things we do know and things that we don't know. It can be very hard to discover hope if we stay isolated from others who know our situation, and or others who've had similar losses. So insisting that we know what to do, that we know what's right, and that we have the answers can make it very hard to have an open mind about discovering hope in places that you didn't know were possible, or looking at unknown possibilities. In some ways, discovering hope is the easiest, I think, and one of my favorite of the resilience strategies, because there are some very easy, immediate steps that can help to discover hope. So one of them is humor and laughter, and finding the funny parts of what you're going through that are difficult. And so I will say I have a friend who has breast cancer and has just a hilarious blog about the horrors of that experience on her Caring Bridge. And it really brings a lot of hope, because many people experience that, or will, or have, and at the same time that it's difficult and horrific, there are also some very funny things that are happening to her, and she talks about those. And so it's a form of hope that I find really encouraging. So in our workshops, one of the things that we do is we ask people to think about what are things that you can do to build your own resilience. So the workshops that Emily and I have been doing are designed to go over a period of a couple of weeks, and it's 6 or 8 hours worth of work. And people spend some time identifying what their specific ambiguous losses are, and then what are some steps that they can take to build resilience. And so we ask people to write down, and I'll ask you to think about this in places where you may feel like you need resilience. What is something that you can do today or tomorrow in a very short time frame, and quickly, with the resources you already have, to start building resilience? One of the things about building resilience, it's much like other kinds of self-training. When you start doing it with just a little bit, then you can build on the skill and the memory that you have for those first action steps that you took. And then the next action is just ever so slightly easier, and ever so slightly easier and easier. It's like exercise that way. You exercise your mental space in the same way that you might exercise your body. And each time you do it, you get a little bit better at it. So we ask people to start with thinking about what's one resilient step that they can take, and then just start with that instead of trying to do all 6 at once. If you would like to learn more about these workshops, you can contact either myself or Emily, and we have been training facilitators around the state of Minnesota, and those facilitators are in turn working directly with families. And so if you have an interest in providing programs and being a facilitator, let us know. Or if you want to take a program by one of the trained facilitators, please let us know, and we'd be happy to help you find a match. If you would like a certificate of participation for this webinar, complete the webinar evaluation using the link on the next slide that's going to come up. And you'll also get an email with that evaluation in case you missed the link. And if you want U of M well-being points, you can get 200 well-being points for coming to each one of these webinars, which is a pretty good rate of return. Where Emily and I are also U of M employees. And so you can get 200 well-being points for it. To request the points, complete the webinar evaluation using the same link. So it's the same as getting a certificate, and follow the instructions provided to get those points. And here is the link to the evaluation on the next slide. Please fill out the evaluation. It's useful to you not only for your getting your certificate and getting your points, but also it's helpful to us. So if you have suggestions about, well, you know, I wish you would spend time on this, or could you add that, or is there something different you could do? Please let us know. We're happy to oblige, and we're very interested in hearing your feedback about those things. There's a chance you'll get a follow-up evaluation for some of the webinar series in about a month after all the ones for the spring have ended of that series. This series is called the Balance series, and so once all of the Balance webinars are done, there might be an evaluation to those 30 days later. Here are some additional webinars that are coming up. There's 38 webinars in this spring series, and some of them are in Spanish because we have a Spanish component of our extension work. So we have talks in Spanish. There's a list of those. And then family-friendly health earth care, the Finding Balance series, later life decision-making, a financial one, making sense of it all, No Place Like Home, or recovery and health. Ooh, the first link is not loading for me from someone, and what's for dinner. I wonder, Rick, if you can post the first link into the chat, and then that might help. That might help it link better than off the slides. So these are the additional webinars that are coming up. And let's go to, here's also the QR code to look for additional webinars. And then finally, other ways to engage with Extension Center for Family Development. We have Facebook, and we have Instagram, and we have Pinterest and Twitter and YouTube channel, and on LinkedIn. So you can join and connect with people in family development in all of those ways. Thank you very much for your time. If anyone has questions, we have about 12 minutes left, and we'd be happy to open the floor to questions.
Jennifer and Emily, would you like me to stop the recording? Sometimes people are more comfortable.
I think that's a good
asking.
idea. Why don't we stop the recording before the questions?